We are live, fans, with another edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast. My name is Jack Kilby, and tonight we have a very special and rare guest to the podcast circuit, Doug Cassin, who was active in the business in the 80s and 90s and extensively worked for a number of Canadian independent promotions that we'll get into, as well as some work for the World Wrestling Federation at the time as an enhancement talent. Doug, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty good there, Jack. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well. It's getting chilly here in Ontario. How are things in Alberta? That's where you're situated now.
Yeah, it's the same thing. I'm in a little town in Alberta, but it's cooling off, but no snow so far, so that's a good thing. Yeah, and very happy
that
here.
Is definitely.
Go ahead.
Thank you for agreeing to come on. I wanted to do a retrospective on your career and educate the Great North Wrestling fans about your experience, because I think you provide a perspective that is unique in terms of your work with the independents and then transitioning into the WWF in terms of enhancement work. But wanted to start off with asking you about your first exposure to pro wrestling and what individuals or territories made you a fan.
Okay, well, before I answer that, Jack, I'd like to congratulate you on your promotion there in operations at Great North Wrestling, because I think you've got the background, both professional and personal, to do well in that, and I'm wishing you all the best in your future endeavors. And secondly, I want to thank you for allowing me on this podcast, because generally speaking, the people want to see the superstars, the Hulk Hogan's and these guys. And I've been out of the business for a lot of years, 27 years now. So it's nice to get back, touch base with you. And you and I go back a long time, quite a few years. So it's nice to touch base. So all the best on that, Ian. Thank you very much. Or Jack.
So basically you've been out of the business for a while, but
yeah.
you have a lifelong interest in the business. Take us back to where it all began and what your general interest in the sport commenced.
Yeah, it goes back quite a ways. I actually go back to probably about, I'm going to say, the early 60s. I lived in Winnipeg at the time, and AWA Wrestling, Vern Gagne run the wrestling promotion up there. Well, there were different Winnipeg promoters, but he brought the wrestlers up. So I grew up watching Red Bastien, Big Bill Miller, Carl Gotch was another one, Vern Gagne, of course, Yukon Eric, Dick the Bulldog Brower. They all went through that territory at the time. And okay, so I was an 11-year-old kid, and I was really, I got hooked on it, you might say. And we got wrestling maybe on TV maybe once a week, and generally on a Saturday for about an hour, 45 minutes, something like that. There was no cable programming. And they kept a pretty good number of wrestlers coming and going. So I really got interested in it as a young kid. And then, of course, about that time, I started deciding, well, maybe I'll be a wrestler. And I started lifting some weights. And they consisted of apple juice cans with cement in them and a homemade bar. And I had that out, and my father was against that. So I had that out in a junk pile in the backyard. So it was a bit of a challenge training in Winnipeg in January, but I'd get out there and do a few reps with these cement cans. And eventually I got a set of Whipper Billy Watson set of weights in the basement, the old set with a 5, a 3, and a 1.5 pound weight on each side, and a punching bag hanging in the other corner, and did hundreds of reps with that. And so I watched AWA wrestling pretty well till I left home. I went into the Army, And I was stationed in a couple of different places, Alberta, New Brunswick, Manitoba. So whatever the local promotion was there, whenever I could, I would watch it. And I started to watch the Cormier brothers out in New Brunswick in, I'm going to say, the early 70s. And at the time, there was a fellow by the name of Fred Sweetan. Fred Prosser was his name. Eric Pomeroy, of course, the Cormier brothers, Leo Burke, the Beast, and such. J.J. Dillon came up, and they would bring in different guys. They brought in Luthez for a week to wrestle. Luthez, the Mongolians. In later years, the Cuban assassins showed up, and it was good wrestling at the time. So when I could, I would get down there to watch. And what happened, I guess this would be the spring of 1971. I was thinking about that the other day. We had a weight room in the Army base, but it wasn't like they have now. It was some standard weights with a mat plowed into a corner of a storage room. So whenever I got a chance, I would go down to the YMCA in Fredericton and have a workout. And I was going into the wrestling matches there one night, and I went in early, and there was a young Dino Bravo in there lifting weights. So if you check the records, I knew who he was. I'd seen him on TV, a couple of times. But anyway, he was in there lifting, and at the time, Jack, he was maybe, I don't know, 220, was quite a well-built guy. And he was strong for that era. He was bench pressing at the time around 365 pounds. And back then, before the performance enhancing drugs and whatnot, that was a pretty good bench press. I mean, anybody who, lifted the type of weight that you did in your day and things like that, there weren't too many people in Canada doing that because there wasn't a gym on every corner. Anyway, we didn't become friends or anything, but we traded off a few sets of bench presses, and then he went a little harder than me. I spotted for him. And then that night he wrestled, and he wrestled Leo Burke, and Leo pinned him with a neck breaker and 1, 2, 3, And at the time, then they were building up to something. Killer Carl Krupp ran in and had a big run in, and so they were building up for a big feud with Killer Carl Krupp. And what generally happened in that territory, it ran from the spring till the fall. And the Cormier brothers would bring in some villain, a different one every year. And this year of 71, they brought in Carl Krupp, who worked for them for a lot of years. And they'd build up a crescendo over the years with a feud, and come about September, October, when they closed the promotion down, they would send this villain packing until next year. So it was pretty well the same scenario every year, but it was good wrestling. And then I had taken my discharge from the Army a number of years later, and I went into another profession, which we can talk about later. So I moved to Winnipeg, where the same thing. I would the odd time run into a couple of the AWA wrestlers working out in the gym, and Peter Maivia, he was in there one night, and Rufus Jones, and a lot of these different guys. And then anyway, at the time we had a training college in Edmonton, Alberta. And I had gone out there for a while, and that's where I first met John Quinn. And he was working for Stu. Quinn. Yeah, he was working for Stu Hart at the time. And John bounced around from one end of Canada to the other. He wrestled in Europe, England, South Africa, all over the States, different territories, So anyway, as it was, we started to become friends, but it wasn't like today where you can pick up your phone and text a guy or whatever. And but anyway, I got to know John fairly well, and then he came back from Europe. I'm going to say in the 80s, and but he retired from the wrestling business. He was pretty well had his fill of it, and we convinced him to come back. Well, I did pretty much. What had happened when Al gave up his promotion, Rocky Della Sera, Fred Roselli, and we tried to revive the sinking ship, and it didn't work because we were basically rebranding the same thing that Al had given up on, you know. But anyway, I talked to John, and I got him to come out and work for us a few times, and that was good. But by then he was in his early 50s, and and we just didn't really draw, and it just didn't work. But I was reading, and by the way, and I'm sure you've got it, is Vance Nevada's book, Uncontrolled Chaos.
He's going to be a guest on the podcast in November, actually, Doug.
Okay, well, excellent. Well, anyway, he had mentioned a little bit about that time period. He missed a few things, I thought, but he mentioned a little bit about that time period there. And so Rocky and I gave up on it, as did Fred Roselli, but we ran shows for about 6 months, I guess. And then about the time, Michelle Starr, who he was pretty enthusiastic, and he basically kept BC wrestling going. He started a little promotion, and away it went. He went through the tough times. I'm sure it wasn't easy for him, but he kept going, and until just recently when he got out of the wrestling business. So he hung in for another 25, 30 years, something like that. So that in a nutshell is what I did. I met a few different people along the way. I did some work through Michelle Starr. Actually, we continued to work for on and off with Michelle Starr. I had a full-time job, so I gave up a lot of opportunities to work. But we still worked with Michelle Starr, and a few different people tried promoting indies in the BC area there. And then I got booked with Michelle Starr to do some work with the WWF at the time.
And let's circle back to that in a minute. I definitely want to ask you about the Vancouver territory and your work with Tomko and some of the notable names to that. But before we get there, can you describe your training experience and how you were broken into the business?
Yeah, for sure. Basically, how I started was I got to know John Quinn, and I talked to him about getting into the business, and he said, no problem. He said, I'll show you a few things. He didn't really smarten me up at first, but he showed me a few things. It didn't take me long. I got smart to the business like you did. You didn't really have to be told anything. And so what happened was I did a few things with John Quinn. I still trained. At the time, I was relatively strong. I competed in powerlifting and competitions at the time. I competed in Highland Games, and I also was a judo competitor. So I kept active that way, and then I got a hold of. I would see John when he was in town, and then he had moved back to British Columbia, so he showed me a few things, and then basically he turned me over to Rocky Della Sera, and Rocky and I trained a little bit, and then we came up with a program where I would be a referee, and finally got tired of all the cheating, and so Rocky would teach me how to wrestle, and of course Rocky and I did train. We went to parks and did calisthenics and went through some different variations, some holds, and worked some different holds, much the same as you and I did at one time. And then we just went from there. I found that wrestling, your best way to do it is learn in the ring. You can get the basics, and you can't just step in without knowing anything. But the more you get in, and I got a little more confident as I wrestled a little more and a little more, and I worked with some good guys. There was Michelle Starr. He was actually a pretty good wrestler. He took it seriously. There was another fella by the name of Moondog Moretti, and I worked with him a few times down in the States. Actually, we went as far as through Washington State and to Northern California. I worked with Moondog a couple of times. An excellent guy, very respectful, and he always taught you something. And at the time, Colonel De Beers and Buddy Rose were back in town. They had the AWA had folded, or pretty much the territory was over. And so I worked with them a little bit. There was some guys from Washington State that I'm in contact with still now. Dale Avery, he was wrestled as Dale Houston. Another fellow, Marty, I can't recall his last name. He passed away a few years ago. And then, of course, there was all the El Tomco product, who there were a pile of good workers, I thought, that even though they were on a small indie circuit, they knew their business. There was guys like Dale Goutreau. He wrestled as Robotron. You would know him. Randy Tyler, Mike Roselli, another one. He knew what he was doing. And Diamond Timothy Flowers. I really can't say enough about his wrestling work. As a person, he was actually a pretty good guy too. But he had his issues at times, like all of us. But Timmy was good, and he would show you in his way the different things that he'd talk you through a match. And so I thought he was a really good mentor. There was other guys.
We have a fan question from Craig Seaback. He wants to know, how big were the crowds on Monday nights at the P&E Gardens?
Oh, wow. You know what? I don't think at one time they were pretty good. But until when Kaniski and Sandra Kovacs ran the show. But in later years, and I'm going to say probably about 1980, the early 80s, the crowds dropped off very significantly. Numbers I'm not sure, but it wasn't. El Tomco started moving over to the Kerrisdale Arena, and then a lot of little gymnasiums and school halls and Cloverdale Arena, which they had used for many years. But so in terms of numbers, I can't give you an exact number, but they had died off pretty significantly in the 80s. And I recall we were lucky to get probably 100, 150 people at Cloverdale on a Saturday night. And, in hindsight, as I look back on it, I didn't know a lot about running a business of any kind, let alone the wrestling business. So crowds were dropping off. It was over, and as we found out, it was overexposed because wrestling was there every Saturday night with the same crew of guys, And again, they were, guys like Vern Siebert. He had wrestled all over the place. He was a hell of a good worker, but it was just too much. And I think Michelle Starr come up with a good formula there for a while with All Star. He was working the building once a month. He would go to maybe Abbotsford or some other place, but he would be in Cloverdale once a month, and he seemed to be drawing some good houses in.
I wanted to. You've touched on this already in terms of the Al Tonko promotion. I think in hindsight that All Star Wrestling on BCTV doesn't really get the amount of acclaim that it really should, in terms of the fact that it was the first nationally televised from coast to coast wrestling product before Vince, etc., and produced some really top quality workers. In fact, All Star Wrestling in the Tomko years, and actually a little bit before, when they were in NWA territory was the promotion that I remember distinctly watching as a 5-year-old kid and going, what is that? And that's what ignited my my fandom. And I'm partially interested in if you're aware of the transition from becoming an NWA territory to Al running himself. And if you have any, there's a lot of information online, be it good and bad, about Tomko. I'm wondering if you had any, before we get into some of the workers that you've already touched on, if your experience dealing with Al Tomko, what that was like.
Okay, well, Al, when he gave up the promotion, I didn't know Al personally. I didn't know him that well, but I did meet him, and everything I had to do with Al, I can't say anything bad about Al. He tried to keep the business going. Al came up with he had some good ideas. He tried that all women wrestling thing for a while. He introduced music. I don't know if you recall, but all of a sudden the wrestlers were coming into a song, and I think that was before the WWF. I could be wrong, but I think Al was the first guy to introduce that. And Al had been around the wrestling game for a long time. Actually, he had been a promoter in Winnipeg, and then he moved out to BC. I would guess 79, 80, somewhere in there. But anyway, and Al had an office in the Cloverdale Hotel upstairs from the Hug and Slug there, and he had pictures of Ric Flair when Ric Flair had worked for him in the early days, and at the time Ric Flair weighed about 280. Al showed me some of those pictures one time, and Roddy Piper. So I don't know exactly what happened, but I think what was happening, my guess, is that Sandra Kovacs and Gene Kiniski weren't making the money that they wanted to anymore. And Al took over the show. And, it was in the 80s when Cablevision was out now. The WWF hadn't taken over everything, but, you could turn on your TV and you could watch a football game or a hockey game any night of the week. And there was more variety in wrestling. With the Cablevision, you could get wrestling from different places. So I think there was a whole series of factors that happened, all in that time frame. And the other thing was too, people were starting to get a little smarter, and wrestling at one time. And if you recall when you were younger, Jack, a body slam and a 1, 2, 3 was a big thing. Well, by 1980, these guys were flipping off the ropes and doing all kinds of stuff, and the fans basically were just demanding more and more, And so I think it was getting harder to compete in that way, but I'm going to give Al credit for what I knew of him. He was always polite and respectful to me, and he did his best. And Al was a goer because he lived just over the border in Blaine. He lived on the U.S. side, and he opened after wrestling there. He started some business where you get these leather bones for dogs. So he went from the wrestling business into that, and he gave that a try. He was, so anybody who knows Al, for the most part, they speak relatively highly of him. I'm sure he's like anybody. There's going to be people who, disagreed with him or didn't like him. But, a lot of the guys, you talk to guys like Moondog Moretti and old Moose Morowski. Moose used to speak relatively highly of Al, at least every time I ran into him, So
it's interesting with me that he gets a lot of criticism for making himself the center of the promotion and the champion when he was past his prime, and yet people like Jerry Lawler don't seem to get that same amount of criticism. But
exactly, and most guys who run a wrestling promotion, they, like Vern Gagne, he was 57 years old and he was still the AWA champ, and Lawler's another example. And I think, although I've never worked for them or knew them, but the Von Erichs down in Texas, So anybody who's running the promotion has got the strap, and they don't want to be held up by some guy in the middle of a main event with a full house or whatever. So I didn't have a problem. I can understand why Al did it. And he brought in both his boys they weren't big guys, but they were good wrestlers, And Al would bring in, he brought in, like he had John Tenta working there, and big, what was his name? The big BC Hulk there. He got these guys in, and Al really, he tried to get it going, but yeah, he was the center of the promotion, and he wasn't going to impress people in the wrestling ring itself. But I always thought he had a good mind for the business, and he tried to keep the boys working, So apart from that, I don't know anything about his personal life. I know that Ole Olsen, rest in peace. Ole told me one time when they went on the road, when they came home, Al would always, let it, because Ole lived in Washington. Al would always let him stay at his house overnight before he went, And the stories are legendary about Al's ketchup soup when you're on the road. These small packages of ketchup, he'd grab a handful out of the restaurant and put it in hot water and make tomato soup. I never saw it or tasted it, but I've heard the stories.
Well, I guess you gotta pinch pennies when you can when you're on the road working the indies. You touched on, and I'm just gonna fire a couple of names at you, but you touched on Diamond Timothy Flowers, who was one of the first workers that I saw that really ignited my fandom. I remember his pile driver very, very well, and how impressive it was. You worked a number of matches with Tim. Do you have any memories of the programs that you've had with him?
Oh, many. Tim Flowers, you're right. His pile driver, he knew what he was doing. A brief history. I think Tim broke into the business about 1979. So I know he wrestled in Kansas City, and he did some work in Los Angeles and up through the Pacific Northwest, and so he knew what he was doing. He was one of these guys who had a good wrestling mind. And my early matches, he talked me through them, and he would give you lots. He would give you lots. We had one time we went on a road tour up in I forget where it was. It was up in northern British Columbia anyway. And I worked this series of matches with him every night. And we called it, you marry a guy on the road, so you work with the same guy. And by the end of it, I pretty well, after a week, I was getting pretty good at working with him. He had, he was very believable, and that pile driver, I never got hurt by him anyway. And he was good. I saw him. It would probably be about 5 years ago now, and he works at Costco, one of the Costco stores. So Timmy would probably be getting pretty close to retiring. I would bet he's probably 65-ish right now, but he's working at one of the Costco stores in the Lower Mainland there, and he had some health problems. He had some issues there, but he was still enthusiastic about the business, and he came up to Kelowna where I ran into him, and there's a fellow there that promoted a series of cards that they give the money. They help out homeless people or different charities. I'm not sure what exact ones. So Timmy kind of got the ball rolling up there a little bit, So yeah, I have a lot of good memories with him, and I worked with him in a number of different places throughout the. We went out of town, Hope, and one shot. We had a few shots in Agassiz where he was really good with me. That was my hometown at the time. And of course, Timmy would never allow himself to be pinned, but he gave you lots, and he come up with some really good storylines. So I've got lots of good things to say about him. A lot of people didn't like him because he could be had a few rough edges around him, but that was just the way he had been brought up and learned through the wrestling business. But once in the ring, he was all business. There was no playing around there. He did the best he could. He was professional, and he wasn't shy about telling you what you did wrong, though. There was, no soft soap in it. He was like Moose Morowski in that regard.
Yes, an individual who I don't think gets the credit that he deserves still in this day. But one of our mutual Facebook friends that I wanted to bring up is the great manager Jonathan Fuzzy Sayers, who could get heat like there was no business. And I know you've had a lot of interactions with him and want your impressions on him as both a wrestler initially, but what I remember him as a kid is getting on the mic and stirring up the BCTV audience.
Well, to tell you the truth, you're entirely right, Jack. To tell you the truth, I wrestled him once at the Cloverdale Arena, and he talked me through the match pretty good. He was good that way. He knew his business. He had been around, but at the same time, when I was having a series of matches with Tim Flowers, Fuzzy was his manager. And he also managed another friend of mine that I worked for in Florida a couple of times, Mark Benedict. And he went by the name Gator Belong. And Mark had been around the wrestling game for a lot of years. And so Fuzzy primarily came in as a manager, and he was a great heat magnet. He was a very soft-spoken guy, very good with the boys, I thought, and generally just an all-around good guy. And I think you probably saw it. You never knew what the hell he was going to do when he came out for an interview. He'd have some glasses on that were stars, and he had initially been broken in when he was about 18 by Rocky Johnson, and in those days too, wrestling, as John Quinn told me, this was before I got into it, it was a very closed business. You just didn't get into it, and they would get a lot of guys and they would hurt them on purpose, and it doesn't take much. You get a guy on the mat and you get a shoot hold on him and twist his ankle. Well, there's not much he can do once, So Fuzzy had his ankle broken twice. And I think he was about 18. He's alluded to it on some of his podcasts. But he kept coming back, and eventually, I don't know his history of where he started or how he got into the business, but he kept coming back, and I think he was one of these guys. He did a good interview. He did a good promo. And again, the times that I met him, he was a very polite, respectable, soft-spoken guy. So again, there was a lot, I thought, anyway, for what it was worth. I thought there were a lot of good hands out there on El Tomco's circuit. The guys like the younger guys who had come up, Dale Goutreau, Iton, Randy Tyler. These guys, they could bounce up and down over the ropes, and they knew what to do, and they were always good, in the dressing room. And there were a lot of the guys that came up from Washington State, that Richie Magnet, and who had been around. Buddy Wayne, he was another good one. Buddy had a wrestling mind like you wouldn't believe. So I thought El Tomco had some pretty good guys, and a lot of these guys, I'm going to allude back to Buddy Wayne. He did some work. It was more enhancement talent, but he did some work for the WCW. He worked out in the Maritimes for the Cormier brothers. up and down. He ran a wrestling school in Washington. So these guys, they could, if they had probably had got a push or a break, they could have wrestled in the WWF, maybe not been a Hulk Hogan, but certainly do a good job anywhere.
Did you come across a young Mauro Ranallo who specifically got his first start at, I believe, the age of 16 with Tomko's promotion? Did you have any interaction with him?
Yeah, I ran into him a couple of times. He was an announcer, and he was just learning at the time. And you can see that he's moved on to bigger things now. I don't think he'd remember me, but I certainly remember him. And he actually wrestled a couple of times for Rocky and I. There was another guy, a smaller fella too, and he wrestled a couple of times for Rocky and I. And he knew the business. He knew the work part of the business. But I think his heart was into broadcasting and whatever. And as it's turned out, I don't know what he's doing now. I think he did some work for the WWF, and he's announcing some of these mixed martial arts outfits down in the States, I believe. So but yeah, I did come across him, and he was
Craig. Craig wants to ask about Neil Drummond, the referee, the evil referee turned manager.
Well, you know what? I've met Neil Drummond, I think, once. He probably wouldn't remember me, and I'd forgotten all about him. But yeah, Neil Drummond, I think near the end of the run, he bought into the territory with El Tomko. And Neil, I used to watch a couple of their shows, and Neil was actually, he had some good ideas. He was a referee, and then he became a manager. You'd see him interviewed. He had a motorcycle jacket and a baseball bat, and I think he worked a couple of shows where he actually worked against Moose Morowski. So you can imagine that. And I'm not sure what he's doing now. There was that crew, Neil Drummond and Mike Olson, who they all worked in there, and they seemed to do good, but it was just too overexposed, and there wasn't no way you were going to make any money. And about that time too, I think about the time Neil started, shortly after, they lost their TV rights too. So that certainly didn't help things.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I don't know.
You had some interplay with Portland and came across some of the talents there. How did that exchange of services, so to speak, go? And I understand you had some interactions with an early Raven or Scotty the Body.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Well, what had happened, I think at the time, Don Owens was getting out of the business or kind of giving things up. I'm not really sure what was going on there. And so there were guys coming up from Portland and wrestling in Washington. We did a show in Northern California one or two times there at a rodeo ground. That's actually where I worked with Moondog Moretti, probably the first couple of times I ever worked with him. And so those guys would come up to Cloverdale. Buddy Rose was one of the guys. Buddy Wayne. Colonel De Beers worked a few shows there for a while. And also a fellow by the name of Jimmy Snuka come up, and he worked a show for, he headlined with Colonel De Beers. Actually, it was about the time they had finished their AWA feud, and he worked up in Abbotsford for Michelle Starr. I worked on that show, and I remember those two were up there. So I think everybody, basically free agents, and they exchanged services when they could, when it was feasible, and that's basically how it worked. There was a bunch of guys from Washington State, as I mentioned earlier, Dale Avery, and I just can't remember. There was quite a crew of guys that would come and go up there. Richie Magnet, Billy Two Eagles was another one. I'm not sure what's going on with him nowadays or what's happening. And actually, we worked the show in later years. It seemed to be a mishmash of everybody moving around and working where they could at the time. And the two Kaniski boys put on one, the big blonde guy, whatever his name is, they put on a show in
Kevin Kelly.
Kelly, I think, yeah. They put on a show in New Westminster at an arena that his father used to do. And the other brother came up. The other brother come up to work with him under a hood. And so that show I worked with Rocky De La Sera, and there was a few guys that come up from the States, and Timmy Flowers was there, a number of guys. So that's how it seemed to work. Just everybody melded together and took the opportunity when you could. I was working, I had another full-time job at the time, so I was starting to get to the point where I had to concentrate on this other job that I had. And so I kind of stayed away from the wrestling business for a while. And John Quinn, him and I had talked about it. John was 50 years old. He'd had enough and everything. So that was about the time and then I decided to transfer back out to Manitoba, to my hometown, to a work location there. So, and that's about it. Go ahead.
You work for Stu Hart though at Stampede Wrestling. Do you have any memories of that experience?
Not really, because I didn't have much interaction with him, and also my main thing in Calgary was when we went up there to work for the WWF. So I did meet all those guys, and Stu had kind of dropped the business, dropped it, and there was a guy named Fred Sissons who took it over. And so we worked there in Calgary a couple of times. I forget the name of the place. And that was where we had no, it wasn't the Pavilion. It was a casino or some dang thing. And anyway, it was a guy by the name of Sissons who ran the promotion. And so we had a mixture of some of the Calgary guys, but any of the big stars, Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy, they were long gone by then, So, yeah, it was quite a time. And by then I was starting to just have had enough of the place. I was seeing the drugs, and it wasn't the kind of wrestling that I had expected or grown up with. Things were changing in the territories and everything. So
you touched earlier on your work as an enhancement talent with the World Wrestling Federation. Yeah. How did that come about? And do you have any memorable? I remember as a kid watching you against the Big Boss Man, where he handcuffed you to the rope and beat you with a nightstick. So, well, how did that come about? And do you have any other memories?
Oh, I have some good memories of that, because I didn't do it long, but the memories I had were intense. First of all, when I got there, of course, you're a little bit intimidated, in the back room, all these stars, but it turned out 99% of them were just really good guys. They were just down-to-earth guys making a living, making a pretty good dollar. How it came about was through Michelle Starr. He initially, and he did a lot of work for the WWF over the years, and he initially got me and Vern Siebert and Mike Roselli. We went to Calgary here in Edmonton and did a shot there, and we did some TV tapings where we did jobs for the so I ended up working with Tugboat and Earthquake, the Nasty Boys, a couple other guys. I can't just recall who was all there at the time, but that was in the days of, there was Kerry Von Erich, and Bret Hart was working there at the time, doing fairly well. And anyway, I was at the time, believe it or not, I worked in a prison. So I had an opportunity. Well, they have a chalkboard there, and I was working the big boss man. And at the time, he was doing this gimmick of the prison guard. So I was the bad guy, the heel, of course. And went in there, and he was a great guy to work with. He didn't, there was no problem there. But he did his thing, and he hit me with a nightstick and whatever, and did what he had to do. And then at the end of it, he put the handcuffs on you, and he'd handcuff you to the rope. And he had the key in his pocket, to somebody. I can't remember if he or somebody else would got you loose. But anyway, yeah. So I worked with him, and at the end of the match, of course, I was handcuffed to the rope. Well, that match was on TV, and we had a number of inmates who saw it and knew who I was. And there was, and that was about the time they started to get TVs in their cells. And there was one guy there who was a particularly troublemaker and an idiot, but he believed wrestling like, and the big boss man was shooting me around the ring and doing this and doing that. And you could hear him all over. The guy said you could hear him on the tier, kill that sow, give it to him, And the inmates were there. What the hell are you doing cheering for the cop, And the inmate was, and I guess it was quite the joke at the time, because you could hear him, give it to that sow, because we didn't like each other, of course. So that kind of sticks out in my mind, the aftermath. And actually, he had told me a couple of times I saw him, I'd see him in a hallway or something. That looked good on you, he says, but the inmates were all on him, because what the hell are you doing? You're cheering for the wrong guy, you dumb son of a buck, But yeah, so
the prison guard.
Yeah, I have some good memories of that. And those guys, of course, when you're working with guys like that, they're all pros, they know what they're doing. You basically just have to go in and do what you do, and it's done, But yeah, so it was quite interesting. I guess I mentioned Michelle.
Sorry, go ahead.
I guess I mentioned, I think I did mention that it was Michelle Starr who organized everything and got me booked there along with some other guys. And him and Mike Roselli, they kept going back there. Moondog Moretti worked for them too as an enhancement talent. He did a little more than I did, but he was well known throughout the business too,
You told me previously about an encounter that you had with Macho Man Savage that I thought would be a good story to share with the public.
Yeah, you know what? I've been reading. I'll get right to that. I was reading a couple of podcasts, and everybody said he was a cheapskate, and he did this and did that, and I don't know. Who knows? I mean, the guys are living on the road, and when he was probably with his father's promotion, there wasn't a lot of money to be had or whatever, But anyway, a bunch of us after the matches, we were in Edmonton actually, and they had after the matches they had we stayed at the Forum Hotel. There were two incidents. I'll tell you. I won't mention names on the second one. We stayed at the Forum Hotel, and there was a couple of us down there eating in the restaurant after the matches, and we had some steaks or whatever you have, and there were a couple of guys that Michelle Starr knew from California who were actually up there working too. They had come up with a guy named Bill Anderson who was well known throughout the wrestling. Well, anyway, there were a couple of us, and I can't remember who all. We were sitting at that table, and we had our meal and everything, and he come in, and actually Ted DiBiase was over there too. But anyway, he come in, and they sat at a different table, and we had eaten, and we got up to leave, and well, he had left, and the waitress said, no, she said, that guy already paid your bill. So he had paid the bill for everybody, And another time, and I think it was probably, we were in a restaurant in Denny's restaurant, I think it was in Calgary too, or maybe Edmonton, might have been Calgary. And Mike Roselli and I we were having supper with these two guys called the Beverly Brothers. And then there was another guy
from the UWA.
Yeah. And then there was another guy named Berserker. Then we felt pretty honored. What, pardon me?
John Nord.
Yeah. And this John Nord, he was one big lad. You could tell he had hefted a few weights in his day. And so we were at Denny's restaurant, and we were having supper with them. Well, we ended up paying our own bill that time, but there was people coming up, and not me, of course, but people coming up and wanting their autograph and talking to them, So, but yeah, I was kind of impressed with that story, and people probably might not even believe it, but yeah, it happened. Randy Savage. So, I've got nothing bad to say about him.
Yeah, he sounds like he was a very generous person, generally speaking. You touched on the fact a moment ago that you worked in the penitentiary system, both in British Columbia and federally. How were you able to balance a straight job like that and wrestling bookings? And what was there ever a point in time where you were considering, resigning from the penitentiary system and going full time on the road?
Oh, definitely. And you know what? Had I not have been mentored by John Quinn, I might have done something that stupid. What happened? It was I was finding it. I was a shift worker, of course, at the time. I was a supervisor of crew of guards, but I was a shift worker, and of course, wrestling tends to be on the weekend in the evening. So I had to a lot of times use my annual leave or do shift exchanges, do whatever I could to get away to wrestle. So John Quinn had a lot of contacts in England. And at the time he said to me, I can we can get a month booking in England. He said, I know I can. And he says, what I'd like to do is he would go and be the heel, because he was a heel over in England for years. He said, I would go be the heel, and you dress up. At the time, one of the Rougeau brothers was doing that Mountie gimmick.
Jock.
And so John wanted to go over there and take me go over. Okay, John gets over and he's the heel, and all of a sudden he's just come from Canada, and I'm the Mountie here to arrest you. And he thought that might go over good for a little while. But again, at the time I was working at the penitentiary. I couldn't possibly get away for a month. Actually, I had just moved into an acting position where I was working Monday to Friday. And so that was about the best I could do at the time. I couldn't get away. So it was a bit of a balance, and I gave up a lot of wrestling because I had to work nights or work weekends, But John Quinn had encouraged me that if I ever did get into the wrestling business, to just go work a show here, a show there. And to me, it turned out to be the right thing to do. He was a great guy. He never told me what to do, but he actually in later years, I got him in for an interview, but they never hired him on. But I got him in for an interview, and he was looking at doing that, to just get some job security and build up a few benefits before he retired. So yeah, it was a bit of a balance there, and you probably know yourself from at one point being a shift worker that you've got to make some sacrifices to do the things that you want to do, and that was one of the other things too. It got pretty demanding trying to balance my job, my family. I was training at the time. I wasn't training as hard as I did at one time, but I'd be having to get up at 6 in the morning to lift weights, to get my day in. But I did that.
That was very good advice that you gave me. Never give up your pension, and that's really stuck with me as well when we were training for the ring.
Well,
what would you say was your proudest or fondest memory of your wrestling career as we almost run out of our time here?
Okay, well, probably my fondest memory was wrestling a match or refereeing a match with Velvet McIntyre Wrestling. She was pretty much, she had wrestled all over the world. She knew what she was doing. And man, in those days, she was hot stuff. I kept my eyes on her pretty much. But in terms of highlights, I think highlights is just met so many great people, yourself included, Jack. I met so many great people in all facets, right from the ground up. Of course, you meet the odd stinker or two, but for the most part, they were guys trying to make a living, guys trying to do a job, and for the most part, they all enjoyed what they were doing. So I think the big thing is I took away some good memories, and mostly it's about the people I met. I was never any superstar. I never drew any big houses, but I did have some good times and with some good people. So I guess I got to end it at that point, and that was it. One of the highlights, real quick before we sign off, I became over the years good friends with John Quinn and my late wife Connie. You knew her, and she became friends with John's wife, and John's wife Linda and I still keep in touch the odd time here and there, and so it was a great friendship, I thought, and Linda and Connie actually hit it off pretty good. So it was a great friendship, and if anything, it's one more great person I met in the wrestling business.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Wrestling is a great business, brings a lot of disparate people together, but as we saw when we were last at Cauliflower Alley, there really is some lifelong quality friendships that are spawned from that, including ours. And I certainly value the 25 years that I've known you and been influenced by you as a great mentor and quality person, both in terms of wrestling and in the government work. So thank you for your contributions to the business and for coming on tonight. Where can the fans find you on social media, Doug?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to return that compliment, Jack, because when you started training with me there, I think you were bench pressing 450 pounds at the time, and you had about an 18, 20-inch arm, 500. Okay.
500, but who's counting, right? You always inflate your bench by 100.
And you weighed about 270, and I thought, well, initially I'm not going to smarten this guy up, but once you hooked on to me, I thought I better smarten this guy up real quick, or there's going to be a few injuries, But in terms of getting a hold of me, I've got a Facebook page. Pretty well, you can send a message or anything, and it's under my regular name, but it's capital D, period, small t, Cassin, Cassin. I'm on Facebook, and I try to keep up with friends and family on Facebook as much as I can on that, and that's about it. I've got Instagram and Twitter, but I have trouble with them. I'm not all that tech savvy on the thing, so I usually get either my 15-year-old or 4-year-old grandson to show me what to do on the computers.
Well, Doug, I want to thank you again for coming on. It was certainly a very interesting perspective on things, and would love to have you back again to get into some of your other stories that we mutually share in terms of the penitentiary service. So once again, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jack. I appreciate being on with you, and it's always great to see you and reminisce a few you remember whens. So great. You take care. All the best.
Right on. And thanks, fans, for joining us again for another edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast. We'll see you next week.